I'm Sarah. Most people think they know how the world works, but I've seen the side of it they hide behind glass towers and expensive lawyers. I'm talking about what happens when a pharmaceutical giant decides to play God with the lives of the people who built it. This is a story about corporate greed and the dangerous secrets buried in the fine print. But mostly, it's about the incredible lengths a multi-billion-dollar company will go to just to silence one woman who had the nerve to stand in their way. I spent 19 years of my life dedicated to one company. I clawed my way to the top of my division, earned more awards than I could fit on my shelves, and I built a reputation that I thought was bulletproof. Then, in an instant, I watched it all vanish. It wasn't because I'd failed or made a mistake. It was because I refused to break the law. This is the story of a $2.4 million betrayal and the explosive federal lawsuit that finally blew their dirty secrets wide open. To understand how deep this betrayal went, you have to see the life I built before the nightmare started. For nearly 2 decades, I was the gold standard at AstraZeneca. I wasn't just another name on the payroll. I was a dedicated sales manager overseeing massive territories across Utah, Idaho, and Oregon. I knew our respiratory products inside and out. I spent my entire career playing by the rules, believing that if I worked hard and stayed ethical, I was safe. My life was stable, my trajectory was sparkling, and I genuinely believed in the work we were doing to help patients get the medications they needed. I had absolutely no reason to suspect that my loyalty to the company's own ethical guidelines would be the very thing that put a massive target on my back. The trouble really started brewing in 2018. That was the year everything changed for me. It was the year Stephanie D'Annunzio was appointed as the new boss of the Respiratory Products Division. I remember the first morning she walked in. The office was unusually quiet, and the sharp scent of her expensive perfume seemed to linger in the hallway long after she had passed. From the very first day she took the reins, the air in the office felt different. It shifted from a collaborative, patient-focused environment into this high-pressure, incredibly toxic pressure cooker, where everyone was constantly looking over their shoulders. To understand why her leadership was so dangerous, you have to know a bit of the history she was intentionally ignoring. Back in 2010, AstraZeneca had been slapped with a monumental $520 million settlement by the federal government. They'd been caught in an illegal, off-label drug marketing scheme, and that scandal put the company under 5 years of federal oversight. We were supposed to be rehabilitated. We were supposed to be the company that was terrified of ever crossing that line again. But under her new regime, those expensive lessons were treated like they were ancient history that never happened. I would sit in my cubicle, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead sounding like a swarm of angry bees, watching her bark orders. According to the documents that would later come to light, she didn't just want higher sales. She demanded them by any means necessary. She started building a culture rooted in fear and intimidation. I watched her mock older employees with a cruel, thin-lipped smile, and she specifically started targeting my age. She would make pointed comments about fresh blood while staring directly at me, trying to make me feel like a relic, like I was obsolete and unwanted. But the personal attacks were just the beginning of the nightmare. The real danger was what she was pushing the sales team to do behind closed doors. She was pressuring us to engage in the exact same kind of illegal off-label marketing that had cost the company $500 million just a few years before. For those who don't know, off-label marketing means pushing doctors to prescribe drugs for conditions the FDA hasn't approved. It's strictly illegal because it puts lives at risk just to pad the corporate bottom line. She was playing a very dangerous game, treating federal regulations like they were just optional suggestions while she bullied anyone who dared to question her authority. For someone like me, who had spent 19 years building a career on integrity, watching her recklessly endanger patients was a line I simply couldn't cross. I noticed she was keeping a very specific set of internal spreadsheets on her laptop, data that didn't match our official reports at all. It was a small detail then, but I made sure to remember where those files were kept. This was the moment I decided to plant my own set of notes. recording every unethical instruction she gave, knowing I might need them to survive. When I was faced with that explicit pressure to push illegal marketing, I made the only choice I could live with. I said no. I remember sitting in my home office, the morning light filtering through the blinds and casting long, thin stripes across my mahogany desk. The air was perfectly still, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. I absolutely refused to tell my regional teams to break the law. But I didn't just stay quiet. I knew that as a manager, I had a moral and legal obligation to stop what was happening. I actually believed the corporate compliance system existed to protect us. I thought if I reported the illegal tactics and the blatant age discrimination up the chain, someone would listen. I can still feel the mechanical click of the keys as I typed out my internal complaints, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and a desperate kind of hope. I fully expected human resources to step in, investigate her, and stop the off-label push. I was so naive. I thought the truth would be its own shield. Instead of treating me like a person trying to save the company from another $500 million disaster, the corporate machine turned its cold, mechanical sights on me. The second I blew that whistle, I might as well have signed my own professional death warrant. Suddenly, after 19 years of excellence, I was a pariah. The atmosphere in the office seemed to drop 10 degrees whenever I walked into a room. Conversations would stop abruptly, replaced by the awkward shuffle of papers and the sound of avoided eye contact. The company closed ranks. They protected the rogue boss and the illicit profits over their own ethics. The retaliation was swift, and it was ruthless. They started building a fabricated case against me, systematically gaslighting me and undermining everything I did. My performance reviews, which had been glowing for nearly 2 decades, were suddenly filled with vague criticisms and impossible goals. I felt like I was walking through a thick, disorienting fog, never sure where the next trap was laid. Then came June of 2019. I'll never forget that day. The Oregon sky was a brilliant, mocking blue, and the scent of fresh pine was heavy in the air as I walked into the building for what I didn't know would be the last time. In a cold, calculated maneuver, they wrongfully terminated me. I remember the uncomfortable feel of the cheap plastic chair in the HR office and the way the harsh overhead panels flickered, emitting a stark glare that made my eyes ache. 19 years of loyalty and stellar performance were erased in a single meeting because I wouldn't let them poison patients for a profit. They threw me out and hoped I'd just disappear into the night. If you've ever felt like the world is tilted in favor of the corrupt, you'll want to see how this ends. Make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications on, because the way this story unfolds is something you need to hear. They thought they had permanently silenced a troublemaker. They thought their scheme was safe and that I was just another disgruntled former employee who would fade away. They had no idea they had just awoken a sleeping giant. I wasn't going to go away quietly. I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what was happening behind those closed doors, no matter what it cost me. I stood in the parking lot, the asphalt radiating heat through the solace of my shoes, and I promised myself that this was not the end. It was the beginning of their reckoning. The weeks after I was fired were completely destabilizing. You don't just walk away from a 19-year career without feeling a massive amount of emotional whiplash, like being thrown from a moving vehicle into a stagnant pond. I spent hours sitting in my home office, the silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I just stared at the boxes filled with my awards and plaques, which I had unceremoniously shoved into the corner. The air in the room was stale, smelling faintly of old coffee and the dusty adhesive on the cardboard. Almost 2 decades of my life were packed into that brown paper, and it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the house. The injustice of it all was suffocating. A bitter taste in the back of my throat that wouldn't go away no matter how much water I drank. I had done exactly what every training video, every corporate retreat, and every handbook told me to do. I saw something wrong, and I spoke up with the confidence of someone who believed in the system. My reward was the brutal, clinical execution of my livelihood. The financial anxiety was a constant low-grade hum in the background, but the betrayal cut so much deeper into my soul. This company wasn't just a paycheck. It was a huge part of my identity. I had to sit my family down at the dinner table, the only sound being the rhythmic clinking of silverware against ceramic plates, and explain why I was suddenly unemployed. I struggled to find the words to tell them that being honest and protecting patients had cost me everything we had built. The gaslighting from the company was so intense and so pervasive that I actually started to question my own sanity. I would sit for hours, my fingers mindlessly twisting my wedding ring, wondering if I had somehow brought this on myself, even though the evidence in my files told me I hadn't. Meanwhile, back at the office, I knew it was business as usual. I could almost see my old boss and the upper management laughing over expensive lunches, moving on like nothing had happened, entirely unbothered by the life they had just dismantled. They assumed the problem was solved the moment I was escorted out of the building. But as I sat there watching the long shadows of the Wasatch Range stretch across the valley floor, I started thinking about a very specific detail that they were overlooking in their haste to bury me. While I managed a massive territory that included Oregon, I actually lived and worked primarily out of my home in Utah. In the complex world of employment law, that geographical split is a massive, treacherous gray area. I knew their high-priced lawyers were already salivating over that, preparing to weaponize the map against me. They were going to argue that I wasn't protected by the laws of the states where the actual business was conducted. They were building an invisible fortress of legal technicalities, banking on the idea that I didn't have the financial resources or the mental stamina to fight a war on two fronts. They thought my isolation in Utah was their greatest shield. What they didn't realize was that I had spent those 19 years learning exactly how they operated from the inside out. I knew their internal policies better than they did. I remembered a specific, dismissive conversation about the Oregon whistleblower statutes that my boss had tried to laugh off months earlier. She'd mocked how vague those protections were, thinking her corporate title made her untouchable. I realized then that her arrogance was the fatal crack in their armor. This was the moment I decided to plant a legal strategy that would turn their own jurisdictional games against them. They thought they could use the map to trap me in a legal no-man's land. But I was going to use every mile of that territory to bury them under the weight of their own corruption. I found that grief has a strange way of crystallizing into something much harder and sharper, like a piece of jagged glass that catches the light. Over the weeks that followed my termination, the initial numbing shock started to fade, and it was replaced by a burning, righteous anger that I had never felt before in my entire life. I spent my nights huddled in my home office, the very same room where I'd worked so hard for 19 years. But the space felt alien now. The desk lamp cast a pool of stark, yellow light across my scratched wooden desk, leaving the rest of the room in deep, unsettling shadows. I was looking at everything through a different lens, one stripped of loyalty and corporate optimism. I started going through the evidence I had carefully preserved, the long chains of emails that I had printed out, the paper feeling heavy and significant in my hands. I revisited my glowing performance reviews from before the trouble started, noticing the contrast between the praise and the later, manufactured criticisms. Most importantly, I laid out the documented proof of that illegal off-label marketing push. I looked at the handwritten notes I'd taken on the explicit, cruel ageist remarks my boss had made, the ink slightly faded but the words still stinging like a fresh slap. It was then, in the quiet of the midnight hour with only the hum of the computer for company, that I realized I wasn't just a victim of a bad manager. I was a witness to a massive corporate crime. AstraZeneca had made a fundamental mistake. They underestimated me. They thought that by firing me they had broken my determination and sent me scurrying into the shadows. But all they really did was strip away my restraints. I no longer had to play nice, follow the corporate script, or worry about protecting a brand that clearly didn't care about me. I was completely free to burn their illegal operation to the ground, and that was exactly what I intended to do. I decided right then and there, as the cold Utah wind rattled the window pane and the house creaked in the night, that I would not let them get away with it. I wasn't going to let Stephanie D'Annunzio destroy my entire legacy just to protect an illicit profit margin. I began the grueling process of finding the right people to help me fight back. I needed lawyers who weren't intimidated by the sheer size of a company like this. People who could stare down a multi-billion-dollar giant without blinking. I eventually partnered with a formidable legal team, including Anita Mazumder-Chambers and R. Scott Oswald. We spent countless hours in conference rooms that smelled of stale coffee and expensive stationery, dissecting the timeline of events. I watched them work, their brows furrowed in concentration as they built a case that was as meticulous as it was devastating. Declaring war on a giant like AstraZeneca is a daunting task. They have infinite resources and an army of corporate defenders whose only job is to crush anyone who dares to speak up. But I was relentless, fueled by a determination that felt like iron in my blood. On October 16, 2019, as the golden leaves of autumn swirled on the pavement outside, we finally sprung the trap. I walked into the U.S. District Court for the District of Oregon, the air inside the building feeling cool and sterile against my skin. I officially filed a comprehensive whistleblower and discrimination complaint. I laid every single dirty secret out in the public record for the world to see. The age discrimination, the toxic environment, the illegal marketing scheme, and the ruthless retaliation I suffered for trying to do the right thing. I wasn't just asking for my job back or a simple apology. I was dragging them into the unyielding glare of a federal courtroom and demanding total accountability. The war had officially begun, and I was the one leading the charge. For nearly 2 years, the lawsuit ground its way through the slow, heavy machinery of the federal justice system. It was an exhausting period of my life, marked by a constant low-grade fever of anxiety that seemed to settle deep in my bones. AstraZeneca exploited every procedural loophole, filing endless motions to delay the proceedings, trying to dismiss my claims, and doing everything they could to distract us from the core truth. I remember the stacks of legal documents piling up in my home office, the acrid tang of fresh toner filling the air as we printed response after response late into the night. They were hoping they could simply drain my financial resources and force me into a quiet, cheap settlement that would bury the scandal forever. But their intimidation tactics didn't work on me. If anything, every motion they filed only made me more determined to see this through to the end. Slowly but surely, the momentum shifted in my favor, like a tide turning against a crumbling seawall. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. From June 14th to June 22nd, 2021, the case went to trial before U.S. Magistrate Judge Jolie A. Russo in Portland, Oregon. Walking into that courthouse felt like entering a battleground. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was formal and chilling, a sharp contrast to the humid, early summer morning outside where the smell of blooming roses and wet pavement hung heavy in the air. I saw the elite defense attorneys sitting at the defense table, and they practically radiated an arrogant confidence. They whispered to each other, their expensive silk ties shimmering under the harsh fluorescent lights, and they looked at me like I was a minor inconvenience they were about to swat away with a flick of their wrists. They had no idea what was coming. When I finally took the witness stand, I felt a strange, unexpected sense of calm settle over me. The wood of the railing was smooth and cool beneath my palms, and I could see the fine, intricate grain of the oak under the bright, unforgiving lights of the courtroom. I methodically walked that 6-person federal jury through the entire 19-year nightmare. I detailed my years of service and showed them exactly how my boss had targeted me for my age, his words cutting through the air like a cold blade. Most importantly, I laid bare the illegal off-label marketing scheme that the company had tried so hard to hide. This was the moment I had prepared for, the point where I would plant the most damning evidence into the record, ensuring the truth could never be ignored again. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft, steady drone of the air conditioning and the distant ticking of the clock on the back wall as I described the pressure we were under to risk patients' lives for corporate profit. Their attorneys tried to tear me apart during cross-examination, attempting to paint me as a disgruntled manager who just couldn't keep up with the fast-paced modern corporate world. They leaned in close, their breath carrying the sharp scent of bitter espresso and peppermint, trying to rattle my composure with rapid-fire questions. But the evidence spoke louder than their insults. The emails and the sudden suspicious shift in my performance reviews right after I blew the whistle created a picture that was impossible for anyone to ignore. After 8 days of grueling testimony, the jury went back to deliberate. The tension in that Portland courthouse was thick enough to touch, a heavy static charge that seemed to vibrate in the air. I paced the narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing off the polished stone floors, my heart a steady, heavy beat in my chest as I watched the dust motes dance in the shafts of light coming through the high windows. When they finally returned, the verdict was more than I had even dared to hope for. The jury foreman stood up, his hands steady as he held the official paper. The silence was absolute. They didn't just side with me. They hammered the company. The jury awarded me a staggering $2.4 million in damages. That included $510,423 in back pay and an incredible $1.872 million in compensatory damages. It was a humiliating defeat for the corporate giant, and for a moment I felt completely vindicated. I had stood up to the giant, and I had won. The weight that had been pressing down on me for years finally lifted, leaving me feeling light and breathless in the afternoon sun. If you've ever fought a multi-billion-dollar corporation, you know they don't just accept defeat and move on. They are built to fight dirty until the very last second, fueled by a corporate ego that simply cannot tolerate being told no. The high of that $2.4 million victory was intoxicating. A rare moment where the world finally felt balanced and fair, but my celebration was brutally short-lived. AstraZeneca's legal team was humiliated by the jury's decision, and they immediately launched a massive, multi-pronged post-trial counterattack. I could almost feel their collective fury through the waves of legal filings that began to flood my inbox. A cold, calculated rage that smelled of expensive printer ink and old, dusty parchment. They knew they couldn't win on the facts, and they couldn't convince anyone that I was a bad employee after the testimony we presented. So they did what corporate giants always do. They went after the technicalities. They went back to that geographical detail I'd been worried about from the very beginning, picking at it like a scab until it bled. Because I lived in Utah but managed a territory that included Oregon, they saw a loophole they could exploit. In late 2021, as the gray, heavy clouds of November hung low over the mountains, and the first biting frost of winter began to creep across the windows, they filed a motion that was as cold as it was cynical. They argued a highly technical jurisdictional issue, claiming that because I physically resided in Utah, I didn't have the legal standing to claim protections under the Oregon Whistleblower statute. It didn't matter that I managed an Oregon team, that I spent my days talking to Oregon doctors, or that the retaliation impacted business specifically in that state. They wanted to invalidate the entire truth based on a line drawn on a map. I remember sitting in my home office, the heater humming softly and rhythmically in the corner, while I stared at the legal brief. The paper felt rough and heavy against my fingertips, a physical manifestation of their attempt to erase my existence. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if the very breath was being squeezed from my lungs by the sheer weight of their words. And the most sickening part was that the system actually listened to them. Judge Russo, the same judge who had presided over the entire trial and watched every piece of evidence unfold day after day, issued a ruling that felt like a physical blow to the chest. It was a moment of total devastation, a literal earthquake in the middle of my life, shattering the peace I had briefly found. She agreed with their technical argument and formally vacated the entire $2.4 million verdict. I sat there in the sudden, stifling quiet of my room, the blue light of the monitor casting a ghostly, flickering glow on the walls. With one stroke of a pen, she declared that while the jury believed me, I had simply asked for protection under the wrong state's laws. The money was gone. The victory was erased. It felt like I had climbed to the very top of a mountain, lungs burning and muscles aching, only to be pushed off the peak because of a filing error. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a frantic, erratic pounding that matched the steady, relentless metronome of the wall clock. I watched the corporate executives and their legal team through the cold lens of their press releases, practically smelling the smug satisfaction of their victory. They were gloating over their brilliant maneuver, their faces likely twisted into self-congratulatory grins behind the heavy oak doors of their boardrooms. They had used a geographic loophole to escape accountability, leaving me with nothing but a voided verdict and a mountain of legal bills that seemed to grow taller with every passing hour. My stomach churned with a familiar bitter nausea, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. It was a devastating twist that would have broken most people, a calculated attempt to make me give up and disappear into the shadows. But as I gripped the edge of my desk until my knuckles turned white, I realized they still didn't understand who they were dealing with. They thought they had finished me, but they had only ignited a deeper, more resilient fire within me. I think AstraZeneca expected me to just roll over and give up after that. Most people probably would have. Having a $2.4 million victory snatched away on a cold legal technicality is the kind of soul-crushing defeat that can permanently break a person. I remember standing by my window in the days following the judge's decision, watching the gray sleet of a late winter storm slide down the glass in jagged streaks. There was a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of hot coffee could seem to warm. The house was unnervingly silent, save for the low, mechanical buzz of the refrigerator, making the emptiness of that vacated verdict feel even larger and more oppressive. But they fundamentally misunderstood my resolve. I hadn't spent years fighting through their lies, enduring their depositions, and facing their intimidation just to let a geographical loophole protect their corrupt scheme at the finish line. That setback didn't destroy me. It only made me realize that I had to change the way I was fighting. My legal team and I immediately pivoted. We weren't going to accept that vacated verdict as the final word on my life or my career. I spent endless hours on the phone with my attorneys, the plastic of the receiver warming against my ear as we meticulously mapped out our next move. We began the intense, grueling process of drafting an appeal to the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. This is one of the most powerful courts in the entire country, and we were moving the battle to a much bigger, more public stage. This wasn't just about a single trial anymore. It was about setting a trap that would permanently close the jurisdictional loophole they had so smugly crawled through. My lawyers were incredible, constructing an unbreakable argument by dissecting decades of complex case law until their eyes were bloodshot. I watched them work through late-night video calls, their desks cluttered with yellow legal pads and half-empty water bottles, their voices raspy but determined. We prepared to argue that the physical location of an employee's home office cannot be used as a shield by a massive corporation to escape accountability. If an employee is managing staff and conducting business in a state, they should be protected by that state's laws, plain and simple. It was a logical and moral argument, but we had to translate it into a language the appellate judges would respect. I felt a grim, quiet satisfaction as I signed the new filings, the dark ink from my fountain pen soaking into the thick, cream-colored paper with a slight, scratchy sound. As we officially filed the appeal, I felt the tide starting to turn again. I was dragging them out of the comfortable familiarity of the lower courts and into deeper, more treacherous waters where their heavily compensated legal team wouldn't be able to hide behind simple technicalities. They thought the war was over when the judge vacated that verdict, but I was just getting started. I was moving my pieces into position, my jaw set in a firm line of iron, and I was going to make sure that this time, there would be no escape for them. They had poked the bear, and now they were going to find out exactly what happens when you try to steal the truth from someone who has nothing left to lose. When the case finally moved into the hallowed high-ceilinged halls of the Ninth Circuit, the entire atmosphere shifted. Gone was the theatrical energy of a jury trial. In its place was a quiet, almost clinical intensity. The air in the courtroom was cool and carried the faint, scholarly scent of old leather bindings and lemon-scented furniture polish. There is no jury here, only a panel of highly experienced federal judges who look at the law with surgical precision, their eyes peering over spectacles with a weight that felt both intimidating and profoundly fair. As they began to review the merits of the defense, I could feel the momentum in the room physically change. I sat on the hard, polished wooden bench, my fingers tracing the smooth, cool grain of the wood as I watched the proceedings unfold. I could hear the soft, steady clicking of a clock somewhere in the back of the room, counting down the seconds of the company's stolen victory. The corporate lawyers, who had been so insufferably arrogant and self-assured after they managed to get the initial verdict vacated, suddenly looked a lot less comfortable in their bespoke suits. I noticed one of them repeatedly adjusting his silk tie, his face flushing a dull red as the questioning intensified. During the proceedings, the appellate judges began to rigorously probe the absolute absurdity of their stance with a sharp, intellectual curiosity. They asked the hard, uncomfortable questions that the lower court had somehow glossed over. How could a massive, multi-state corporation argue that an employee managing their Oregon division shouldn't be protected by Oregon law just because her bed was located across a state line in Utah? As the judges spoke, there was a profound revelation that rippled through the room. They weren't just looking at my case. They were looking at the future of work itself. They began to dismantle that technicality brick by brick, right in front of everyone. They recognized that if they allowed companies to exploit remote work geography like this, it would create a dangerous precedent for every worker in the country, effectively giving big corporations a license to retaliate against anyone who worked from home without fear of consequence. The defense that had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress was now visibly crumbling under the weight of actual, cold logic. I could see the subtle signs of panic starting to set in with the corporate executives seated behind their counsel. The frantic whispering, the nervous shuffling of heavy legal binders. Their brilliant loophole was being exposed for exactly what it was, a desperate, cowardly attempt to avoid paying for their illegal actions. They had spent millions trying to build a wall of technicalities around themselves. But the Ninth Circuit was starting to tear it down. And there was nothing their expensive lawyers could do but watch it fall. The air felt heavy with the collective realization that their luck had finally run out. And for the first time in years, I felt the sharp, clear light of justice beginning to break through the clouds. It was a Tuesday in May of 2023 when the heavy hammer of justice finally fell, its sound echoing through the digital halls of the Ninth Circuit. I remember sitting at my desk, the morning sun casting long, pale shadows across the hardwood floor, and the air smelling faintly of the rain that had washed the streets the night before. My hands were trembling slightly as I refreshed the legal portal, my heart hammering a frantic tempo against my ribs. Then there it was, the published ruling. After years of exhausting litigation, resolve-breaking emotional turmoil, and the kind of relentless corporate bullying that would have silenced anyone with a lesser resolve, the Ninth Circuit issued its definitive word. The decision was a masterstroke of poetic justice, written with a clarity that felt like a cool breeze on a fevered brow. The appellate judges didn't just disagree with the company. They thoroughly and systematically rejected the cynical geographical defense that the corporation had hidden behind for so long. They saw through the smoke and mirrors. They ruled conclusively that I had provided more than enough evidence to prove that my claims fell squarely under the protections of the Oregon Whistleblower statute, regardless of the arbitrary lines the company tried to draw on a map. That technicality they loved so much, the one their highly paid counsel had polished like a trophy, was officially dead and buried. As I read the words, I could feel the tension that had lived in my shoulders for years finally begin to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread through my chest. But the court didn't stop at mere interpretation. They delivered the ultimate reckoning by officially reversing the lower court's decision and ordering the full, unconditional reinstatement of the original jury verdict. In an instant, the $2.4 million that had been cruelly snatched away from me by a judge's pen was handed right back. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes as the reality sank in. The company's multi-year campaign to silence me, to bankrupt my determination, and to erase my truth had completely and spectacularly failed. I thought about all those elite appellate lawyers in their plush, wood-paneled offices, the millions of dollars the company had poured into their retainers just to avoid accountability. It had all been a total waste of their resources. They were trapped now, defeated by the very truth they tried to bury, and forced to surrender to the will of the law. The reinstatement of that verdict wasn't just about the money. Though the financial security was a profound relief, it was a loud, undeniable confirmation that they had broken the law. They had retaliated against a person who dared to speak up, and then they had tried to cheat their way out of the consequences. The very legal system they tried to weaponize against me, attempting to use its complexity to drown me, had become the instrument of their total humiliation. If you've been following this journey and you believe that no one, no matter how much capital they command, should be above the law, make sure to subscribe and stay with me. This story is a reminder that even the biggest giants, with their endless pockets and phalanxes of attorneys, can be brought down if you have the courage to stand your ground and wait for the truth to catch up. The whistleblower stood victorious in the quiet of that May morning, while the company was left standing in the smoking wreckage of their own defense. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the birds outside, finally feeling the weight of the world lift. I had finally earned my peace, and they had finally truly earned their reckoning. The fallout from the Ninth Circuit ruling was immediate, and for the first time in years the crushing weight on my chest vanished, allowing me to finally breathe. I sat at my kitchen table, the steam from a fresh cup of coffee curling into the morning air, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of violet and gold. It was as if a massive shockwave had hit a house of cards. For years, the company had tried to keep our dispute tucked away in dark, forgotten corners, but now the permanent public record was there for anyone with an internet connection to see. It detailed everything: the toxic culture they had allowed to fester like an untreated wound, the aggressive retaliation tactics they used to try and break my determination, and the disturbing reality of the off-label marketing push that my boss had been spearheading with such reckless abandon. They couldn't hide behind sealed settlements or complicated legal jargon anymore. The truth was fully exposed in a landmark federal appellate decision that could never be erased or ignored. I started hearing that the entire pharmaceutical industry was taking notice, the news spreading through professional networks like wildfire, and I knew this wasn't just a win for me. It was a warning shot to every executive who thought they were untouchable behind their massive executive desks. The ruling established a powerful precedent that sent a cold chill through corporate boardrooms across the country. It essentially told every multi-billion-dollar company that they cannot use geographical, technicalities, or remote work arrangements to strip whistleblowers of their legal rights. For a company like AstraZeneca, the reputational damage was immense and, frankly, it was well-deserved. They had already paid $500 million years prior for similar illegal marketing, and now they were branded once again as an entity willing to endanger patients and destroy a 19-year career just to protect their quarterly bottom line. I often thought about the executives who had greenlit the vicious legal strategy against me. I could almost imagine them pacing their expensive offices, the silence there now haunted by the consequences of their own choices. They were left to answer for a multi-million-dollar loss and a massive public relations disaster that they had created themselves. Their dirty laundry was permanently aired, serving as a glaring warning to any other manager who thought they could bully an ethical employee into silence. They tried to grind me into dust, but the gears of their corporate machine finally jammed and groaned. In the end, it wasn't me who was broken, it was the machine itself that shattered under the weight of its own corruption. I watched from the sidelines as they scrambled to do damage control, but you can't unring a bell this loud. The Ninth Circuit had spoken, and the world was finally listening to what I had been saying since the very beginning. Every trade journal and legal blog was dissecting the case, and for the first time the narrative wasn't about a disgruntled employee, but about a company that had failed its most basic ethical obligations to the public and its own people. For me, this victory marked the end of a grueling 4-year nightmare. It is hard to describe the feeling of a weight that heavy finally lifting off your shoulders, but it felt like I was waking up from a fever dream. I had faced down one of the most powerful companies in the world, and I had emerged triumphant. The $2.4 million payout provided the kind of financial security I thought I had lost forever when they walked me out of that building in 2019.
It fully replaced the wages I had unjustly lost.
And it finally compensated me for the immense emotional suffering I had endured during the years I spent fighting them. But if I am being honest, the money was never the best part. The best part was the absolute, undeniable vindication. For years I had to carry the shadow of that termination. I had to explain to my family, my friends, and my peers why a 19-year veteran with a flawless record was suddenly gone. Now, I don't have to explain anything to anyone. The federal court system has loudly and publicly explained it for me. I was right. I was right to say no when they told me to break the law. I was right to report the misconduct. And by refusing to compromise my ethics, I know I protected countless patients from medications being pushed for the wrong reasons. I have reclaimed my life, my reputation, and most importantly, my peace of mind. I went from being a victim of retaliation to being a symbol of what happens when you refuse to back down against a bully. I look at my career now and I realize that my legacy isn't the sales I made, but the stand I took. I have spent the last few months just learning how to enjoy the quiet again, without the constant hum of legal battles in the back of my mind. I'm not the same person I was before this started. But in many ways, I am much stronger. I have learned that a single individual, if they have enough heart and a good team behind them, can actually hold the most powerful institutions in the world accountable for their actions. They say that karma has a remarkable way of eventually collecting its debts, and I'm living proof of that. AstraZeneca thought they could discard me like a piece of trash to hide their illegal schemes. But all they did was hand me the exact weapon I needed to expose them to the entire world. My story is a permanent reminder that integrity is never a weakness, and the truth is something that cannot be buried, no matter how many mountains of legal briefs you pile on top of it. When you stand up for what is right, even when the odds are stacked impossibly high against you, justice can still find its way to you. It might take years, and it might take every ounce of strength you have, but I can tell you from experience that it is worth every single second of the fight. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this journey and listening to my story of righteous revenge. I hope it reminds you that you have more power than you think you do. If you want to see more true stories where corporate giants finally get exactly what they deserve, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss an update. I have plenty more secrets to share, and you definitely won't want to miss the next one. Leave a like if you think justice was finally served. And tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear if you have ever had to stand your ground against a bully in your own life. Until next time, stay sharp, stay ethical, and always remember to stand your ground.